Melody. I'm Joyce Parker and welcome you to Theater on KK's presentation of Voices from the Cafe. The illustrious author, Mr. Dave Lachance, is in the audience. I'd like to talk to him. He will be available to answer any questions you might have. I'm happy you chose to spend this evening with us. I am always at a loss for words, what to say. Maybe Dave could say better things than I, but rather than just say sit back and enjoy, I say sit back and absorb.
It was late spring and just after sunset when I returned to the town with the broken bridge. The town was calling to me with a chorus of frogs who were living in the floodwater marshes along the river's edge, and with a flood of memories living in my dreams. All that had made me join those who had fled to the east was behind me now, and though I was determined to bring about the rebuilding of the bridge, all I could think of was seeking the forgotten hope and safety of home. My arrival was noted only by a scattering of people who were silently watching my passage over the river from its darkening shores. They too had only recently returned from the east, and though they were unmoved by my arrival, I hoped that they would be moved by my plans. I had lived in the town before the bridge was broken. My home lies within sight of the river, and I was relieved to find out that it was still uninhabited by the living or the dead. I had grown up there, was wed there, and became widowed there, and now I wish to rest in peace there. In the evenings, my beloved and I had often played our instruments in the cafe at the base of the bridge, and our music inspired others in the cafe to tell stories of forgotten lives, dreams barely remembered, and desires best left alone. Together we filled the river's valley with our souls. Those who heard our music longed for more. But all too soon I had to play my violin alone. Shortly afterward, the darkness enshrouded us all. The cafe's owner had fled east along with the rest of us, but deeded the establishment to me when it became obvious that he would never return. When I awoke the next morning, the cafe was the last thing on my mind. Though people were returning, I felt that the town would not survive long without the bridge. And I spent the day visiting those that I believed would best understand my plans for its reconstruction. Though all who I spoke to heard my words, many of them told me that they felt that the bridge should not be rebuilt, because they knew that rebuilding the bridge would bring many other people to the town. Some, like ourselves, would be returning from journeys beyond the bridge, but we would also be buffeted by many others who were not so experienced. The inexperienced would not want to hear what we spoke of, and soon there would be no safe place for us to remember or speak of what had happened before. In the end, we would become strangers in our own land. I lived with these thoughts for many nights before I had the dream. My soul was called to the heavens by a woman in red. And there I looked down and saw the town and surrounding countryside had become a violin. The pathways leading to and from the town had become the violin strings. But the instrument was useless because it lacked a bridge. Seeing this, I turned to the woman for guidance. But she merely smiled at me and said, "Tell me a story." I nodded, and she gave me a bridge. The next morning, I went to the cafe, and when I opened its door, a dog ran out and disappeared. A clock with no hands hung on the wall, and the only person inside was Rosita, a life-size doll of a woman dressed in red, which had been created by the theater troupe that had regularly performed there. Though the cafe had a formal name, it was often called Rosita's Place, for she had been cast in numerous productions. Between productions, she often sat in a place of honor at the cafe, and many chose to dine with Rosita rather than to dine alone. Rosita had been left behind when the troupe fled east. Since their departure, she had sat quietly at her usual corner table, and as always, bore mute witness to our exits and our entrances. In many ways, she was the spirit of the cafe. Going further, I found that the basement had been flooded and a home to frogs, but the rooms above the main floor were habitable. I moved in, and within a short time, its main fireplace gave warmth and firelight again. Having rekindled the hearth, I spent the next several nights under the watchful eye of the community while I made solitary efforts to reconstruct the bridge, and my evenings playing my violin with Rosita amidst the shadows cast by the firelight. Finally, a small girl peeked her head in the door while I was playing a lullaby to the town, and she came in to hear me play. I played on, and my newfound friend nestled next to Rosita and fell fast asleep. Her parents came looking for her and were greatly relieved to find her sleeping with her head on Rosita's lap and Rosita's hand on her head. The next evening, the girl and her parents came back to the cafe, bringing food in their arms and music in their souls. Later, while the small girl slept, her parents told me of their journey east. In the morning, I did not have to work on the bridge again, alone. With each passing evening, more voices were heard from the cafe. Some were quiet, some were loud, and some said very little. But they all had stories to tell, and we all tried to listen to each other.
Someone gave me a gift the other day, an empty cornucopia. Gathered in a dream giver's circle, in seaweed-scented sand, my people were in great need and no longer knew how to give. We asked the dream giver for help and were sent to dream, each of us waking with a key in our hands. Gathering again, we found a large box, and another key was found to be its mate. Each key opened a box which lay further within until the last key was turned. Inside the smallest box lay the cornucopia. All fell silent, for the dream giver was gone, and none of us could see which of us could heft the mystery or have the right to speak of what was needed. Lots were cast, and the sun and the moon chased each other across the sky many times, while each of us in turn rose from the circle, raised our hope with the cornucopia, and received nothing in return. The circle remained unbroken, but not those of us who had joined it, for the winds that we had set in motion had brought us only to despair. We diminished, and I became alone. Empty boxes my only company. The dream giver returned and asked me to raise the cornucopia once again. I rose with mockery in my eyes, and but for the lack of all the keys, would have returned it all to where it had been found, as I left the circle, hoping never to dream again. The dream giver held me back and told me that the cornucopia only gave what it was empowered to give. For us, it was a time when nothing was possible, although we held all possibilities in our hands. It was only out of emptiness that creation could occur. Fated and enslaved by shattered and dying dreams, we had learned to expect only disappointment when anything hopeful came into our lives. Thus, 'twas what we had learned of hope that had brought us to despair. But what has been learned can be unlearned. It was lonely. So I raised the cornucopia once again, and I spoke of the need to undo what had been done.
never had a chance. Perhaps he had been sent by God, a sacrificial frog sent to keep my family glaring and my reflection in Pastor's eyes, rather than notice a drawing coffee stain on Pastor's shirt. Maybe only the impeccable can preach the word and be believed. So it was better to have Easter sermon fall on steel temporarily hardened by the mud stains on my sister's new dress. Our journey home from church was noteworthy, only for its silence. And worse yet, my attempts to seek forgiveness from my sister that evening came to no avail. Finally, stuffed bunny in hand, I retired to my room, hoping to make peace with her the next day. But unfortunately, my plans were put astray by the fire. Though my eyes were barely open, my father passed me into the night through my window and gently placed me in the branches of a familiar tree and told me to climb down to the earth below. And after one final hug, he turned and was gone. I wanted to wait for his return. But when the fire spread into the tree's crown, I realized that I would be forced down. Terrified, I asked my dog Nameless, who was barking at me from the base of the tree, to give me guidance during my descent and to care for me when I reached him. And having commended myself to the animal, I started down. The tree's burning crown bent over to touch the ground, driving me away in time to avoid being crushed by my collapsing home. And by the time my uncle reached me, all were silenced and all was done. I never liked my aunt, often chiding us for real and imagined indiscretions. Her judgment on the fire was passed to the memorial service. Soon, many came to understand that I was responsible for the death of my family. Cultivated by the silence of many, her believers often prayed for me during church service, ostensibly so that God would grant me the wisdom to seek forgiveness for what I had done. And thus I would prevent a similar fate from befalling my own children. Pastor became the keeper of the keys for the gates of hell, arriving early each Sunday to open them wide and receive us all. The pulpit became a snake oil salesman's prop to sell words from a silent book. Words which were purported to bring forth hope, but in fact merely engendered self-delusion. Nameless and I often walked alone. Growing older, we took to wandering in the night, coming and going through my bedroom window, freed from all human bonds while all others slept. And with Nameless as my guide, I grew to know the land around me. Together, we caught glimpses of my soul. I liked my uncle. It was he who insisted that I be allowed to spend my evenings sitting in the fork of the birch tree. Its fallen crown was my Jacob's ladder, and Nameless was my guard below. Steward of my lands until I came of age, my uncle spent many a night on the couch bespeaking on my behalf. I only remember my uncle crying once, but it was years before I could see the tears. A neighbor accused nameless of a hen house raid that I had witnessed the night before. My testimony and pleas on his behalf were to no avail. Having been quickly bound to the ground, Nameless was shot by my uncle in place of a stray. Powerless and disconsolate, I left the dead to bury the dead, only to be met by an angry mourning that had been waiting for me along the side of the road. Following into the church, I was surprised to find the building peopled with dying hopes, empty lives, repressed needs, and other dark reflections of those who had found the structure to be an acceptable place to abandon such ghosts, and always hopeful that they would be listened to. These discarded images visited in the night, bringing words and tokens which allowed them to pass into dreams. After gathering a pile of stones from the churchyard, I began to throw them at the pulpit in an attempt to free us all from the influence of the place. And at first, my new friends cheered my attempt. But they vanished when I realized the pastor had quietly come in and was handing me the stones. The windows wouldn't budge, and Pastor was between me and the only door, but he stood with no anger in his face. His outstretched hand held only a stone. Enthralled, I pace-waxed the pulpit while he returned our stones to the churchyard, explaining that I wasn't the first to use them, nor was I likely to be the last. Pastor said that many had not been able to understand. According to Pastor, many in the community had been deeply disturbed by the fire. And largely unguided in their grief, they found themselves grieving for the dead the fire had left in our midst. And metaphorically speaking, being haunted by all that was yet ungrieved in their own lives. After the fire, I was never seen alone, but rather I was always accompanied by images of unfulfilled lives. My aunt and her minions were unable to speak with their ghosts. Consequently, they could not learn to forgive those they held responsible for giving the spirits life. And hoping to silence their ghosts by attacking the medium, they prayed for what was most lacking in themselves. Through the open door, we saw my uncle walking towards us from down the road. While waiting for him to arrive, Pastor confided in me that he had come to realize that while it is vital to teach each other to forgive and accept forgiveness, we must first choose what it is we are giving and accepting. Pastor said that for many, forgiveness is at best a treaty subject to bargaining, betrayal, and withdrawal. And at worst, it is merely an indulgence. Perhaps forgiveness would serve us better if it were offered as simply an acknowledgement of the forgiven's humanity. By the time my uncle reached me, all were silenced and all was done. My uncle and I walked home, and together we buried my dog. Long after Nameless's grave had merged with its surroundings, my aunt and her friends remained devout. Finally, my aunt announced that she would no longer break bread with a murderer. My uncle grew to like the couch, and I learned to cook. Shortly after completing my internship as an architect, I went to our annual church picnic. For many, the news of births in my recent passage counterbalanced the news of deaths and Pastor's broken leg. Were it not for the outbreak of food poisoning which followed, our gathering would have simply merged itself into the congregation's memory. Within a few days of the picnic, much of the congregation had fallen ill. 5 were dead, and at least one family was facing financial ruin. Many quickly came to understand that it was my aunt's canned vegetables that were the source of their illness. And each sunrise brought her news of dreams fulfilled. 4 days after the gathering, my aunt disappeared from her home. Those of us who could set out to search for her. But my search was guided by the now familiar angry morning I had met before. I sat next to her in the church, and from my outstretched hand, she took the loaf of bread I had baked the night before.
Souls fell from above, disgorged from a dead machine. They joined the wreckage on its journey down. One screamed and thrashed at the air, only becoming peaceful after grasping a piece of the craft that had been so recently aloft. Together they continued their plunge. The other followed the new course and felt the sunlit cloud and led a flock of geese and danced with autumn leaves. Journey's end, both died.
Nagasaki Shadow. That was the name on my hospital bed patient chart. I gave it to him. It's the only name I could remember when they asked me who I was. Me and my brother used to play in the shadows of our house. Disappearing and reappearing, jumping in and out, in and out. Till others came and asked us to play. He died, but I don't know exactly when. He was killed coming ashore somewhere, and the person that recorded his death was killed also, and the list was lost. I found out about it through a letter from home, but I lost the letter too. I hated him after that. As part of the occupation force, I found the time and resources to darken my hate. I marveled at the bomb's destruction. Friends took pictures of me standing next to shadows of vaporized people that were left by the bomb's glaring light. In honor of my brother, we formed the Nagasaki Shadows, after those whose images bore silent witness to the bomb and greeted survivors with aplomb. We hauled away part of a broken wall with a nameless shadow on it to serve as our mascot. But our team was soon ordered disbanded, and grudgingly we buried him that day. Soon we were allowed to return to our faintly remembered home. Shortly afterward, I was returned there, and out of necessity had to learn to work cooperatively with people I hated and despised. I lived in a pastel, and the game silently continued. The place I was living in collapsed one misty dawn, and I never expected to be found. Lost in a great nightmare and thrashing in pain, I tore my nurse's dress, exposing burn scars from the bomb. She slapped my blushing face and ran away. A few days later, a little boy appeared in my half-lit doorway with a football in his hand and a hydrangea plant from his mother under one of his arms. He had been told that I was a famous athlete and asked me to autograph his ball. A blanket had been laid over my chart and hid the origins of my fame, so I told the nurse she could stay. He returned the next day with friends, and many of them had footballs in hand and siblings in tow. They told me jokes, showed me some of their drawings, and asked me to come out and play. I told them to come back on a brighter day. The morning I rose, my nurse held me as we shuffled down the hallway. We were accompanied in our walk by the hallway's yellowed whispers and smiles as we stumbled back to my room. Later I learned that her entire family had been killed by the bomb while she walked to the Urakami Cathedral. In honor of them, she has to take care of me. Kate stated, I quietly told her of the origin of my team's name. She gently took my hands and used them to make shadow pictures on the wall. She told me that everything we are exposed to casts a shadow. If the experience is a pleasant one, we can rejoice in it. If it is painful, it can cause scar. If it is overwhelming, it can reduce us to a shadow of what we are. I asked her to change the name on my patient chart. And when she left, I continued to make shadow pictures on the wall. The next day, the little boy and his friends returned, and together, we went out to play.
I saw her again the other day, the middle-aged ballerina. She was dancing down the crowded sidewalk like she'd done so many times before. Harmless, but artistically inclined. Our loveliest street crazy was performing for us again, perhaps inspired by the unresponsive artists around her. She stopped when she noticed a sketchbook and set of pencils I had purchased as a gift for one of my grandchildren, and touched me gently on the face. Touched by the ballerina, I remembered my father touching my face just before he died, my latest sketches falling from his other hand as he passed away. Our home was too cold to allow us to stay with him, and a friend offered to take us in, so we left my father alone. Shortly after the burial, we broke my father's bed into fireplace wood, cooked our last meal there, and warmed ourselves while we made final preparations to move on. Spring came, and lacking any other means of transportation, we boarded our boat and became yet another family who had abandoned their home. We found refuge in a town along the river and ferried those who passed between its shores. Summer came, and I drew it with the pencils and paper my father had always so cheerfully provided for me. My sketches recording them, the smell of mud, birdsong, and cool breezes passing through my hair. And my abilities grew with my lengthening frame. War came and brought new opportunities for all of us. I learned new skills, traveled widely, and viewed the works of many great artists. However, increasingly their works only filled me with debilitating awe, and finally, after repeatedly feeling embarrassed by my simple sketches, I abandoned my sketchbook in the museum's gallery somewhere and joined some friends in the museum's cafe who were involved in making preparations for our return home. After the war, I used my new skills to help buy a home for my growing family, and for our children's education, we took them to art museums whenever we could. Over the years, I often followed the ballerina with my eyes when she passed nearby, but I was too afraid to move with the artist, and hence unable to continue watching her perform. Time and the jostling crowds inevitably veiled her and left me standing alone. Touched by the ballerina, I found myself dancing by her side and moving along a path I had barely known before. At the end of our dance, I bought another sketchbook, a set of pencils, and went home.
I overheard a lover's quarrel the other day. The weary couple had planted its seed long ago and brought it here on a train. Following someone else's words, they had moved into a nearby inn and lived there for many years while waiting to receive further guidance about an important journey they were on. At first, having forsaken all and longing not to be still, the couple only ventured beyond the inn stores to see what others knew of why they had come. Well, finding none, they learned to wait. But news of their inquiries quickly reached beyond the inn, and soon many people came to hear them speak of their plans for travel beyond the town. The innkeeper was delighted. Lacking the means for an indefinite stay at the inn, the expected couple finally ventured into the community. Not for word of travel, but for friendship and employment during their delay. Finding these in abundance, their stay was assured, and soon a multitude of friends and acquaintances dined at the inn, making peace with them before retiring lest word come and they depart during the night. The innkeeper thrived. Children were born to the sojourning travelers, and fleeting words came of loved ones dying and lost. In turn, they expanded their quarters and shared their grief with their friends. Word of the inn's unusual guests spread afar, and many foreign souls came to the town in hopes to both mingle with its people and speak with the respected couple about their journeys. The town waxed festive, and soon others came to the inn telling of strange journeys and dining with anybody who would break bread with them. Well, reaching outward, as all those around them were drawn within, the couple began to purchase empty estates within the near countryside. It brought them to abundance and used their profits to purchase dusty shops within the town. These in turn were brightened and filled with eager new shopkeepers hoping to partake of the town's growing festivities. So, growing older, the couple were openly discussing their fears that only one of them would complete their journeys. When a visiting grandchild told them of their plans to join them. So, hearing this, the lovers quarreled. They came together and they decided to leave. They left the inn, and at the appointed time, a train came and took them home. The innkeeper was pleased.
called Death's home the meat locker. My old friend Death and I used to talk about that often. Bounded by wilderness to the north and west and open sea to the south and east, I knew of no other place like the Haven, and, like all people of the Haven, had lived my life shadowed by the meat locker's intermittent, ghostly flame. Built sometime during the plagues upon the ancient ruins of an island shrine resting in the river between the Haven and the western wilderness, we knew well the law scribed upon its base. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest-tossed, to me. So we did. Each morning, those who had been chosen during the previous night for removal from the Haven were gathered together by those around them. These, and the dead, were placed aboard a galley, brought to the meat locker after nightfall, and quickly left behind. Children were never among those who were removed, but their elders quietly taught them how to recognize those who should be selected for the fate. Though children often taunted each other about the island, many a sleepless child had startled loved ones who had been gazing forlornly at the island during the night. Most of the chosen cooperated and left quickly, some silently, some with great speeches, but all were marked so that they would not dare to return, and left with the firm understanding that friends and loved ones who spoke out on their behalf were likely to join them. Once they were gone, our home was healthier, and so our choices were affirmed. I was born in the city at the Haven's western edge, and though I was discouraged, had often tried to talk with the others about what might lay beyond our land. Consequently, I was often shunned and eventually selected for removal. Though I didn't endorse this decision, I did leave quickly, by an ancient bridge which connected the Haven with the western wilderness. Early after nightfall, my escort and I passed the bridge on the way to the galley, and since no one else could believe that someone would willingly set foot upon it, I simply walked over the river and into the wilderness. By the time I had reached the other side, most of the world had been freely conceded to me by those who could not follow, and they ran to tell all the others of my deeds. I wandered over the face of the earth for many days, unmarked, but with no hope of return, hoping to find others who had gone into the wilderness before me. But I didn't find a soul and began to fade away for lack of hearing another's voice. I met death while tending a midwinter fire which gave little heat but demanded much attention. Death arrived in the darkness on a pale horse with a ponied horse he had brought for me. Having learned that I had crossed into the wilderness, my unexpected guest had left the island in hope of finding someone who would lead others across the bridge. 3 days later, we were on a first-name basis when we crossed the bridge again. Riding side by side, our backs were warmed by the setting sun, and our arrival was accompanied by a moving orchestra of barking dogs, hushed cries, and running feet. All knew Mort's face, and unbridled fear had passed through the land when it was learned that death had arrived via the returning galley the night I had left the Haven and crossed over the bridge shortly after I did. Though few knew my face before I had become chosen, many shuttered faces etched my face into their souls while we made our way to the galley to arrange for passage to the dreaded island's shore. The night passengers were already aboard the ship when we arrived. Our luckless captain, already accursed by many for bringing death to Haven's shores, quickly joined the oarsmen below rather than stand above on death's voyage home. Mort took the tiller and with booming voice convinced the crew to begin again the journey they knew so well. Our arrival was announced by dogs who had been sniffing around gawking corpses that had been left on the shoreline, adapted to an unfettered life on the island, silently greeted our arrival and began to paw for food from the living and clothing from the dead. The galley quickly pulled away and disappeared into the shadowed darkness which projected from the Haven's shores. For lack of hope or anywhere else to go, the newcomers chose to follow death, our horses and I, through the meat locker's doors, and were surprised to learn that it was filled with art-laden, many-chambered halls and the faint sound of violin music. Wrapped in darkness, other boats had often come, filled with unsummoned offerings that had been sent in exchange for the baseless hope of keeping someone safe from visiting death. Though such trade was often without sanction, there was always someone with a boat and a crew strong enough to make a foray to the island for a fee, and so art, food for both man and beast, and an endless litany of offerings made their way to death's door. Alerted by the dogs whenever a boat arrived, Mort frequently chose to watch silently as the boats were unloaded, and crews often returned to Sweet Haven with an ever-growing load of stories to tell for those who would listen. The night I arrived, I found a comfortable place and fell asleep while listening to such tales to the accompaniment of music. Morning came, and with it came the timeless social responsibilities all face who have survived the previous night, interacting with the living and caring for the dead. A large number of the living and the dead had arrived on the island since Mort's departure, and, as anyone who has traveled knows, the first day home is always marked by a frantic effort to finish all the new tasks which have accumulated since their departure and to re-establish a feeling of normalcy. Mort's holiday was no exception, and, while I attended to the living, my gracious friend began attending to the dead with a growing sense of urgency. Though some of the chosen always conveniently disposed of themselves by drowning in the river, many of them were now acting as a source of food for the island's dogs. Much to the surprise of those who would speak to me, all who were abandoned on the island were offered to be ferried to the river's far shore. A few accepted and, like many others before them, were left to venture into a trackless land, knowing that neither I nor death had seen anyone else beyond the river. Those who chose to remain followed one or two paths their predecessors had blazed before them. Invariably, they either quickly adapted to life on the island or died. Some by starvation, some by disease, and some by their own hand, or the hand of others. Often silhouetted by works of art while they lay dying, these greatest works of art were time and again comforted by death's embrace and gentle song while they quietly faded away. The dead were loaded onto a horse-drawn stone boat and placed in a stone-lined bowl which lay just outside my new home. They were to be burned in mass, their ashes washing to the river below through holes in the bowl with each passing rain. Twilight came, and I thought the gathering of the dead had been completed, but the sound of the violin began to waft over us all, and I began to follow Mort's reluctant footsteps and the music through the meat locker's doors. We were led into a large vaulted chamber at the building's core, and there from the rafters hung bodies by the score. The musician who had brought us there and had so gently brought me to sleep the night before was playing beneath their feet. It was going to be a long night. The musician played on while we lowered them down, but bowed to us all and left the room when the last one descended to the floor. Though each had a story to tell, they all held their peace for a more suitable time, and we offered each of them a ride so that they might join those who were already outside. With the bowl filled to brimming, our musician reappeared, climbed to the top of the funeral pyre, and began to play. All entreaties to join us were ignored, so a lever was pulled and flames began to engulf all those before us. But a tear rolled down Mort's cheek while the music died. The island's torch had been lit once again. After many such gatherings, I decided it was time for the people of the haven to cross the bridge and move on. With Mort at my side, I met the galley one night. I knew the captain from my previous voyage, and so I felt a touch of humorous empathy when he was informed that only the dead should be brought to the island forevermore. His mind easily adjusted to this confusing command, but deadened somewhat when he was told that both I and the chosen, new and island adapted, would return with him that night. Though my return to the haven was uneventful, word that I had returned caused great strife within its people. More so because the chosen were letting it be known that the people of the haven would have to cross the bridge or death would come and claim them all. Though I freely moved among the crowds, few had the courage to ask me if this was true, and fewer still had the courage to listen to my answer. A few weeks after I returned, the galley did not come back one night. 3 days later, it arrived in the morning with Mort and my favorite captain standing side by side. The galley landed, but the crew did not disembark. All those about me were rendered to a hush as death mounted horse and began to ride amongst the people of the haven, only stopping to beckon to children here and there who happened to be outside at that moment. Despite the pleas and screams of those around them, each child so chosen either mounted the horse willingly or was grasped by death and given a brisk ride to the galley where they were handed over to the keeping of the crew. With each such foray into the haven, the turmoil amongst its people grew. Some ran to shelter their own children, while others pleaded helplessly with death and the galley's captain and crew. Laws were cited and curses were rehearsed, which grew louder as the crowd watching the galley grew, but none dared step forward so long as they could believe the galley might not leave their shores. I don't know who threw the first stone, but it was thrown right after death had dismounted and was mere steps from the galley's gangplank. Captain and crew offered no resistance as a volley of stones and other missiles quickly knocked my friend down and continued with much ado until all the children had been secured and run from the battlefield. Mort looked into my eyes and with an outstretched hand pointed to the bridge and passed away. During the night, I carried my friend across the bridge, built a funeral pyre on the river's far shore and lit it with the morning's first light. The fire was barely cooling when the first child appeared, a young man with a fishing pole who had ventured across when he saw me at a place that might give a better bite. He caught one, and in his excitement enticed other children to venture to our side.
Before long, the air was filled with the sounds of laughter and footsteps on the bridge.
In the fall, the town celebrated the reopening of the bridge, and we placed a simple sign above the cafe's fireplace which read, "Out of darkness we have come." In the years that followed, the town became a prosperous city, and the bridge supported the comings and goings of all who chose to use it. And the small girl who had fallen asleep on Rosita's lap often found her own children asleep in the cafe, blanketed by music and firelight. Many who had told their stories while they were rebuilding the bridge moved on or passed away. And newcomers were often amused at people who joined Rosita at her table and chatted about things that happened long ago. Whenever I was asked about these strange people, I merely smiled in answer and played my violin, pleased by the knowledge that Rosita would survive us all.